framework that you developed for youth noise is something that's scalable? So there's sort of two parts to this question, and I can ask the second one in a second. But is it scalable to audiences that may be not operating within a formal learning environment like school or consider themselves students? And how do we measure or understand the value of what is learned if we take it out of an educational context?
Well, the way we're doing it in youth noise is through a social voting system. So it's the community who's awarding the projects documenting the real world activity of the community member. So, I mean, the community is basically quantifying the worth of the project created by the member. So.
But you think it's a model? It feels like a model actually that's come from social network stuff that actually started in the older and is now being brought down and adopted, and so it is scalable. So that's what you're.
Yeah, definitely. And this is informal. You know, it's not in schools.
Well, I mean, I just had this thought about sometimes when I talk about this, I don't like to use the words educational. I like to think about games and learning, because when you start talking about education, it begins to have all kinds of baggage with it. And when you begin to think about, okay, what if we were to develop learning-oriented games, try to say that as vaguely as possible, for, let's say, my grandparents in the place that they live. What does that mean? Like, what does a learning game mean for that particular audience versus a learning game for a younger audience? And this gets a little bit at this question of how do we move beyond content? So if we can say, well, we know that we can design games that may contain a kind of content that we want to teach. And I would ask for my grandparents, well, is there something that they want to learn about? Or is there a broader way of thinking about games and learning for that particular age group? And maybe it connects to this issue of physicality. Certainly Brain Age began to bring in something about just the notion of practice. Like the content didn't matter, but it was a kind of the act of practice and repetition and memorization. So it became a kind of skill, but I'm just beginning to think about when we talk about games and learning for audiences other than youth or even high school students, does it change our conception of what that means? Maybe that's a question for the panel. And maybe it's not a good question. You can tell me that as well.
I think it's a great question. I think taking your grandparents as an example, the people over 60 I know that use any kind of technology at all, they basically use email. And so if it was a game, it would probably be something that's text-based. And it seems that learning there, it would be very important to have learning that was about how to use technology, which I think would be suited to text-based, interactive, and collaborative types of
Right. So one way we see games being used is as gateways into technology or gateways into subject matter. Was there a question over here? Yeah.
Just a point. I was reading something fairly recently that they found that older people actually enjoy driving games because a lot of times they can't drive, and they develop driving games for just kind of, like Little Driver. I think no, they want Grand Theft Auto. You can't drive those cars, but man, you're gonna have fun.
Right.
So I think that the whole notion of looking at types of games by age is not necessarily. I think that people are less concerned with age and more has to do with fun.
Sure. But one thing you're pointing out is that, again, that's a use of a game. So it's to maybe simulate an activity that is no longer available. And often we talk about kids doing that a lot to take on games that things they're not yet allowed to do. So that working at the older audience, it's a sort of reversal in some way. It's interesting. Yeah.
I just wanted to bring up the fact that a lot of casual games. I mean, older people love casual games, and just like an example on artists. I work for a casual game company, and our forum, we have these forums, and the biggest by far is these granny forums, and they're so obsessed about the same games that these little kids are. So it's just. It's not. I don't think age necessarily is, although it is a barrier to some degree about the technology and the interface. I think that's becoming less and less apparent, and it's more about their personalities.
Sure. Right. So my point is not that it's about age, that older an older generation doesn't game, but does it change the way we think about this equation of games and learning when we would think about designing for a different audience? Does it just change the way we might conceive of how we think about the role that games might play in learning for that particular group? Yeah.
So I think it opens up the definition of what is learning a lot more. I work for an education software company, and we run up against the issue that was just being discussed, which is how do you get a school to spend money on something that's not quantifiable? Well, if we're talking about an audience outside of the school, that's less of a problem, because we're talking about people who probably have some disposable income, and the battle, I think, is the technology battle and the what do you want to learn battle. Mm-hmm. You and I learn stuff from games all of the time. I mean, off the top of my head, Civilization teaches me stuff about history all of the time, right? And if you have a non-traditional audience that's interested in a topic that a game's going to cover, and the game is well designed, mm-hmm. it's a whole different battle than how are we getting an institution, schools, to accept and spend hard-earned money on something that may not be a quantifiable learning.
Right. So one thing that you just pointed out there that I think is really important, use the word interested. And one thing that I think that we are really beginning to understand is that games are interest-driven activities. People play games because they're interested in them. We also can talk about learning happens when people are interested. And so I think that there's a lot of research being done right now around this idea of interest-driven participation, not necessarily just around games, but there's a lot of interesting work there that's beginning to codify a set of principles, the conditions that need to be in place to support interest-driven learning. And a lot of those conditions operate around the way that game communities work. And that's why we're beginning to see some interesting parallels and why games seem to be such interesting spaces for many kinds of learning, many modes of learning to begin to happen. Was there another question? I think that, yeah.
I just had a comment on the, or a follow-up, I guess, to the comment about the older demographic and the text-based games. There are two things. One, I heard recently, and I don't know if this is from another lecture I went to, but that women over 40 are the largest percentage of online gamers now. That makes up the largest group. And then the other thing is I've read a few articles about the Nintendo Wii and just how a lot of older groups are now using it. There's apparently bowling leagues that are now doing these bowling competitions in their living rooms with the Wii, which I think is really fantastic.
Right.
I think I have to get one for my dad.
Sure. Yeah.
But
right.
I just thought that was really interesting. And as you said, it's interest-based. And
right.
that's what it's
right. Right.